It was a cool evening in a small town, the kind of night when people gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to share something warm and good together. The community hall was glowing with soft lights, filled with laughter and gentle music. It was a charity gala meant to raise money for children who needed help paying their medical bills. Everyone was dressed nicely, the air filled with the smell of freshly baked pastries and the faint tune of a string quartet tuning their instruments. Toward the back of the hall sat a quiet woman wearing a plain white mask. She wasn't trying to attract attention, yet her presence caught people's eyes. Her mask wasn't fancy, just simple and smooth, covering her face completely except for her eyes. She wore a long dark coat, her hair tied back neatly. She sat alone, listening quietly to the noise around her. A few people whispered, wondering who she was. Some assumed she was shy. Others thought she might be hiding something. But no one dared to ask. The program went on, full of speeches and performances. The mood was light until one of the organizers suddenly looked panicked. The pianist who was supposed to perform next had called in sick at the last moment. The hall's host whispered with the event team, clearly worried. The piano sat silent on stage, its polished surface reflecting the lights like still water. Someone from the staff approached the microphone, apologizing to the guests. "It seems our scheduled pianist can't make it tonight," the host said with a nervous laugh. "If anyone here knows how to play, we would be so grateful to have you share your talent." The crowd chuckled, but no one raised a hand. Then from the corner a soft voice spoke. "She can play." Everyone turned toward an elderly man who had pointed to the masked woman. He smiled kindly as if he knew something no one else did. The woman froze in her seat. Her gloved hands tightened around her small purse. The host followed the man's gesture. "Oh, you can play, miss?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around. She could feel every gaze in the room pressing on her. Her heart pounded in her chest. For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she nodded once. The host smiled in relief. "Wonderful. Please come up. Let's give her a hand." The audience clapped politely as she stood. Her steps were small and careful as she approached the piano. The whispers grew louder behind her. Who was she? Why was she wearing a mask? Was it part of some act? She didn't seem like a performer. She looked nervous, almost fragile. When she reached the piano, she stood still for a second, staring at the keys. Her reflection looked back at her from the black surface of the instrument, a stranger wearing a mask. The room grew quiet, the audience waiting to see what she would do. She sat down gently, adjusting the bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The lights were warm on her hands, and for a moment she thought about walking away. It had been so long since she'd sat at a piano in front of people. She could hear her own breathing, uneven and shaky. But then she closed her eyes. In her mind, she could still hear the echo of her childhood home, the laughter, the sound of her mother humming while she practiced. Music had once been her world. And for a brief second she wanted to feel that again, not fear, not shame, but freedom. Her fingers pressed the first key. A single note floated through the air, soft but clear. It hung there like a whisper before melting into silence. Then came another and another. Slowly a melody began to take shape. Quiet at first, almost hesitant but full of emotion. The conversation stopped. Forks rested on plates. The servers froze where they stood. Every person in the hall turned their attention to her. The music grew stronger, flowing like water over stones. Each note seemed to carry a story, a memory too deep for words. There was sadness in it, yes, but also strength, a kind of beauty that made people's hearts ache. She played as if the piano were breathing with her. The world outside that hall faded away. It was only her and the music, her masked face tilted slightly downward, her hands moving with surprising grace. No one had expected this. The sound was too powerful, too real. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like she was sharing a piece of her soul. The melody shifted suddenly, rising, breaking, then softening again. Some people in the audience felt their eyes sting with tears. They didn't know her story, but through the music, they felt her pain and her courage. For a moment, time stood still. When she finally pressed the last key, the final note lingered in the air before fading into silence. The hall was utterly still. You could almost hear hearts beating. Then all at once, the audience rose to their feet. Applause exploded through the room. People cheered, clapped, and even shouted. The woman bowed her head slightly but didn't look up. She didn't need praise. That performance wasn't for them. It was for herself. The host rushed to the microphone, voice trembling with excitement. "That was incredible. Thank you so much." But when he turned toward her, she was already standing. She gave a small nod, almost apologetic, and began to walk off stage. The applause followed her as she slipped quietly through the crowd and back to her seat. People turned to each other, whispering again. "Who is she?" one woman said. "That piece, I've never heard it before. Did you see how she played?" "Like she'd done it her whole life," another said, but no one approached her. They seemed afraid to break the moment. The masked pianist sat still again, hands folded, eyes lowered. The man who had pointed her out earlier leaned toward her and whispered something. She smiled faintly behind the mask, though no one saw it. The event continued, but nothing else that night matched the magic of that unexpected performance. People talked about it long after, how a mysterious woman had played as if her heart were speaking through the piano. Later, when most of the guests had gone home, the organizer walked around to check that everything was in order. The lights were dim now, the music gone, the tables half cleared. He noticed the masked woman still sitting near the back. He approached gently. "Miss, that was beautiful. Thank you for saving the evening." Everyone was moved. She stood up slowly and nodded. "It was my pleasure," she said softly. Her voice was calm, polite, but it carried a trace of sadness. "Would you mind telling me your name?" the organizer asked. She hesitated, looking down at the floor. "It's not important," she said after a moment. "I'm glad the night went well. That's all that matters." Before he could say more, she turned and began to leave. Her footsteps echoed softly against the wooden floor as she disappeared through the door into the cool night air. Outside, the sky was filled with stars. She walked slowly along the empty street, her coat wrapped tightly around her. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in her mind, mixing with the memory of the music she had just played. Her fingers tingled, that familiar warmth of creation, of connection. For the first time in years, she had touched that part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. She stopped under a streetlight, the mask catching the glow. She reached up and touched it, running her fingers along the edge. Behind it, she was breathing fast, almost trembling, but not from fear this time, from something close to hope. For years, she had hidden from the world, from the stares, from the questions. Music had once been everything to her, until one night changed everything. But maybe, she thought, maybe it wasn't over. Maybe this was the beginning of something she hadn't expected. A quiet return, a step toward facing what she'd run from for so long. The wind brushed against her coat as she walked on. The night was silent again, except for the soft sound of her shoes on the pavement and the distant echo of her own melody still living in her heart. The next morning, the small town was still buzzing with talk about the masked woman who had played at the charity gala. The video someone had recorded on their phone had already started spreading around town, shared between friends and family with messages like, "You have to hear this." Or "It gave me chills." No one knew her name. No one even knew where she came from. People only remembered how she looked. Quiet, mysterious, with a mask that made her seem both distant and somehow deeply human at the same time. At a little cafe near the town square, two waitresses were talking about her while setting tables. "Do you think she's a professional musician?" one asked. "That didn't sound like some regular player." "It sounded like something from a movie." The other shook her head. "Maybe, but why would a real pianist hide her face? It's strange, isn't it?" They didn't notice that the very woman they were talking about had just walked by the window outside, her mask still on, her coat pulled tight against the morning wind. She paused for a second, hearing their voices, then continued walking. She didn't want attention. She just wanted peace. She stopped near a park bench and sat down. Her gloved hands rested on her lap. The sound of birds filled the air, mixing with the faint chatter of people starting their day. She took a deep breath and tried to clear her thoughts, but last night kept replaying in her mind. The lights, the audience, the applause. For years she had avoided moments like that. She had promised herself never to perform again. Yet when her fingers touched the piano keys, it felt like coming back to life. She closed her eyes and remembered a different time, when music was everything to her. She could still see her younger self sitting by a piano in a bright room, sunlight falling across the keys, her teacher guiding her hands gently. Back then, people had called her a prodigy. Competitions, concerts, interviews, and it all came so easily. She had loved every moment of it. But life has a way of changing in an instant. That memory faded quickly as her heart tightened. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. The past was something she had buried for a reason. As she sat there lost in thought, the elderly man from the gala appeared, walking slowly with a cane. He recognized her immediately and smiled warmly. "I thought I might find you here," he said kindly. She turned toward him, surprised but not angry. "You shouldn't have told them I could play," she said softly. He chuckled. "If I hadn't, the night would have been dull. You gave everyone a gift." She looked down. "I didn't plan to, it just happened." He nodded, sitting beside her carefully. Music has a way of finding its way back, no matter how far we run from it. For a moment, neither spoke. The man looked out at the small fountain in the center of the park. "I used to play too," he said suddenly. "The violin? Not very well, but it made me happy. Then arthritis took that away. I tried to fill the silence with other things, but nothing worked. Until last night. When you played, I felt something I hadn't felt in years." Her eyes softened. "I didn't mean to make people emotional." He smiled gently. "That's what good music does. It reminds us we're alive." She didn't know what to say. The kindness in his voice made her heart ache a little. For so long, she had been afraid of letting anyone see her, of being looked at differently. But last night, even behind the mask, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years. Connection. The man stood slowly, using his cane for balance. "They're holding another charity night next week," he said, glancing at her. "You should play again." She shook her head quickly. "No, last night was a mistake. I don't want to be noticed." He looked at her for a moment, then simply nodded. Sometimes what we call a mistake is actually the world's way of asking us to come back. After he left, she sat there for a long time. His words lingered in her thoughts. Come back. Could she ever? Later that day, she walked past the music shop on the corner. Through the window, she saw a young boy sitting at an old upright piano inside, his teacher showing him how to move his fingers. The boy laughed each time he hit the wrong note, his joy filling the little room. She stopped to watch, her hand unconsciously moving in rhythm with the song. The shop owner noticed her and waved. "Come in if you like," he said cheerfully through the door. "We've got a beautiful grand in the back. You look like someone who plays." She froze. The invitation was kind, but it stirred something she wasn't ready for. She smiled behind her mask and shook her head gently before walking away. As the days passed, her story kept spreading. People started calling her the masked pianist. A local newspaper wrote a small article about her mysterious performance. Some said she was a famous musician hiding from the world. Others thought she was a local woman who had lived through something tragic. No one really knew. One afternoon, the event organizer from the gala found her contact through the elderly man. He sent her a polite letter thanking her again for her performance and inviting her to play at their upcoming charity concert, this time for children recovering from burn injuries. She read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. She placed it on her table and stared at it for a long while. The idea of playing again scared her. Not because she doubted her ability, but because it meant reopening wounds she had tried so hard to heal. The last time she had played publicly, her life had changed forever. A night filled with music had ended in flames. She walked to the mirror and looked at herself. Her reflection stared back, a woman wearing a mask, hiding scars the world would never understand. She touched the side of her face where the skin underneath was uneven and fragile. She had spent years believing that this mask protected her from judgment, but deep inside, she knew it also kept her prisoner. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the piano. She heard the melody from the gala echoing in her head. The applause. The warmth. The feeling of being alive again. She sat up in bed and whispered into the dark, "Maybe just once more." The next morning, she visited the community hall early, when it was empty and quiet. The piano still sat on stage, untouched since that night. Dust particles floated in the morning light. She approached it slowly and ran her fingers across the keys. The sound was soft and familiar. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody was different this time, slower, more thoughtful. It was like she was speaking to herself through the music. Every note felt like a step forward, a small act of courage. She didn't notice the janitor standing quietly at the door, listening in awe. When she finished, he clapped softly. She looked up, startled, and he smiled shyly. "I don't know much about music," he said. But that sounded like healing. She felt tears gather behind her mask. Healing. That word lingered. Later that day, she wrote a small note and placed it inside an envelope addressed to the charity organizer. It read simply, "I'll play again." The following week, posters went up around town. Charity concert for burn victims, featuring the return of the masked pianist. People couldn't believe it. The tickets sold out within a day. On the evening of the concert, as she prepared backstage, her hands trembled again. But this time it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. She looked at the mask resting beside her and took a long breath. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience settling in. The soft hum of voices, the shuffling of programs. She touched the piano keys lightly, feeling their cool surface. For the first time in years, she wasn't hiding from her music. She was walking toward it. She put on her mask again, not out of shame, but as a symbol of her journey. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and stepped onto the stage. The hall fell silent the moment she appeared. Her presence alone drew everyone's attention. She sat down, closed her eyes, and began to play. This time her music wasn't about loss. It was about courage, about returning from the shadows. Each note carried warmth and light, telling a new story, one of strength and hope. People listened, some with tears streaming down their faces. It wasn't just her music that moved them. It was her bravery. And somewhere deep inside her, she felt something shift. The music had never left her. It had simply been waiting for her to come back. When she played the final note, the hall erupted once again. She bowed deeply, her heart full. She didn't need to say a word. Her song had said everything. The night of her second performance stayed in people's hearts long after the applause had faded. The town had seen many concerts before, but nothing had touched them like this one. There was something powerful in the way she played, as if she was healing herself while healing others at the same time. Videos of her performance spread online again, faster this time. People from faraway places shared her story. They called her the woman who plays with her soul. Some wrote comments saying her music helped them through dark times, even though they didn't know who she was. But the woman behind the mask didn't care about fame. She wasn't chasing attention or praise. After the concert, she simply packed her things and went home quietly. Her small apartment was simple. A few books on the shelf, a teapot on the stove, and in the corner, an old upright piano that had been her companion for years. She sat there late into the night, replaying the performance in her mind. She could still hear the echo of her own notes. She could still feel the warmth of the crowd. Yet behind that warmth, she also felt something else, a pull toward memories she had tried to bury. After all these years, people were starting to talk again about her music. And with it came whispers of her past, a past filled with light but also with fire and loss. A few days later, as she was walking along the riverside, a woman approached her holding a folded newspaper. "Excuse me," the woman said kindly. "Are you the pianist from the concert?" The masked woman hesitated. "I suppose I am," she said softly. The woman smiled. "Your music. It moved me deeply. My daughter was injured in an accident 2 years ago. She lost confidence in everything. But after hearing you play, she asked to start piano lessons again." "Thank you." The masked pianist's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, but words failed her. All she could do was nod, her eyes soft behind the mask. When the woman left, she stood by the river for a long time, watching the sunlight shimmer on the water. She thought about that little girl, about how music could still touch someone's heart even after so much pain, and for the first time in many years she felt proud, not of her talent, but of her ability to bring hope. But not everyone who recognized her came with kind words. Later that week, an old man who ran a small radio show reached out to the event organizers. He wanted to feature her story. "I think I know who she is," he told them. "That piece she played, it's almost identical to a composition by a young pianist who disappeared after a tragic fire years ago. I remember it clearly. It was called The Light That Stayed." His words started a quiet stir. Some people began searching online, digging through old records and forgotten stories. Soon the truth began to resurface. Years ago, she had been a rising star in the world of classical music. Her talent was unmatched, her future bright. She had written pieces that moved audiences to tears. But one night after a charity concert, The same kind of event she now found herself playing again. Disaster struck. A sudden fire broke out in the hall. She had been rescued barely in time, her body burned, her face scarred, and her family gone. After that night, she vanished from the public eye. Many believed she had died. Others thought she simply couldn't bear the pain. The mask now made sense. It wasn't a symbol of mystery. It was protection. From stares, from pity, from the world that once adored her and then forgot her. When the article about her past appeared online, it spread quickly. The world learned the truth. Her name, her story, her tragedy, everything came out. At first, she didn't want to look at any of it. But curiosity eventually made her open her laptop. She saw comments, thousands of them. Some were full of love. Others were cruel. The internet can be both. People wrote things like, "She's brave beyond words." And others wrote, "Why hide behind a mask? If she's healed, she should face the world." She closed the screen. The noise of opinions didn't matter. What mattered was how she felt. And right now, she felt torn. That night, she sat at her piano again, but the music didn't come. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. For years, her pain had lived quietly inside her. Now the world had reopened it. She pressed one key on a soft note, but stopped. It sounded lonely. Then she remembered the little girl who had been inspired by her music. She thought of the people in the audience, the ones who had cried not because they pitied her, but because they understood her heart. Maybe this was what her story needed. To be known. Not as a tragedy, but as proof that even broken things can create beauty. A week later, the same radio host who had found her story invited her for an interview. "You don't have to show your face," he said. "Just come and talk. Let people hear you, not your music, but your voice." She agreed, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. The studio was small and quiet. The host smiled warmly, speaking gently. "You've inspired many people," he said. "Would you like to tell us why you returned to the piano after all these years?" She sat in front of the microphone, the mask still covering her face, her hands folded in her lap. "For a long time," she began softly, "I thought music belonged to my past. I thought I had no right to play anymore because everything I loved was gone. But when I sat at that piano again, I realized something. Music doesn't care what we look like or what we've lost. It only asks that we feel. And if we still feel, then we're still alive." The studio was silent. Even the host seemed moved. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. She smiled faintly behind the mask. "Pain never truly leaves us," she continued. "But maybe we can shape it into something beautiful. Maybe that's what art is, turning scars into sound." When the interview aired, thousands of listeners tuned in. Many cried as they listened. Others sent messages thanking her for her courage. Some shared stories of their own, of loss, healing, and rediscovery. The following week, she received dozens of letters from people she had never met. Some were from hospital patients, others from teachers, parents, even other musicians. Each one said, in some way or another, "Your music gave me strength." One letter in particular caught her attention. It was from a teenage boy who had lost his hearing in one ear after an accident. He wrote, "I can only hear half the music now, but when I watch you play, I can feel it. You remind me that even broken things can still create something complete." Tears filled her eyes as she read. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." Her story had gone beyond her pain. It had become something larger, a mirror for others who needed to see that they too could rise again. Still, despite all the kindness, there were days when she struggled. Some mornings she woke up afraid of the world's attention, wishing she could vanish again. But then she'd look at her piano and the fear would soften. That instrument was her voice, her safe place, her truth. One evening, the charity group invited her to join a national event in the city, a huge concert featuring artists from around the country, all performing for causes that mattered to them. They wanted her to represent those who had faced physical and emotional scars. She hesitated for days before answering. It wasn't just another small-town event. This would be seen by thousands, maybe millions. Could she stand before so many eyes? She sat alone by her piano that night, staring at the keys. Her reflection in the glossy surface looked strange, half hidden, half seen. Then she whispered to herself, "You've already walked through fire. You can walk through light." And with that, she agreed. The concert was scheduled for the following month. As she prepared for it, she practiced day and night not to impress but to tell her story through music. This time she decided she would play a piece she had never shared before, one she had written years ago but never had the courage to perform. It was called The Light That Stayed. The same melody that had once brought her tragedy was now going to bring her healing, and as the date grew closer, the world waited for the return of the masked pianist who had turned her pain into a masterpiece. The day of the Grand City concert arrived faster than she expected. For weeks she had been practicing quietly in her small apartment, going over every note again and again. The piece she planned to play, The Light That Stayed, was the same one she had written years ago before the fire changed everything. She hadn't touched it since that night. Each note carried a memory, both beautiful and painful. As she played alone, she sometimes had to stop halfway, her hands shaking as tears filled her eyes. But she always started again. This time she was determined to finish it, not as the frightened girl she once was, but as the woman who had found courage in her scars. When the day finally came, the concert hall was full. It was much larger than the small community center where she had first played after so many years. Bright lights, cameras, reporters, musicians, everything felt overwhelming. People whispered about her in excitement. "That's the masked pianist," someone said. "I heard her story on the radio. They say her music can make you cry." Backstage, she sat quietly on a small wooden chair, her mask resting in her hands. The air was full of nervous energy. Singers warming up, violinists tuning, stagehands rushing around. But she stayed still, breathing slowly, letting her heartbeat settle. An organizer approached gently. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded. "As ready as I can be," he smiled. "They're waiting for you. Whenever you step out there, the lights will dim and it'll just be you and the piano. Take your time." She thanked him softly and stood up, placing the mask over her face once again. It felt different now. It no longer felt like a wall, more like a reminder of everything she had overcome. When her name was announced, the crowd erupted in applause before she even stepped onto the stage. The host's voice echoed through the hall. "Please welcome a woman whose courage and music have touched hearts around the world, the masked pianist." She took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the piano. Her heels clicked gently against the wooden floor. The lights softened, focusing only on her and the grand piano gleaming under the glow. The applause faded into silence. For a moment she just stood there, taking in the sea of faces before her, strangers who had come not just to listen but to feel. She bowed her head slightly, then sat down. Her hands hovered over the keys. For a brief second she was no longer in the concert hall. She was back in that night long ago. The same piece, the same piano, the same hope before everything fell apart. She could smell the faint smoke that had once filled her world. She could hear the shouts, the confusion. Her heart tightened, but then she remembered why she was here. She wasn't the girl trapped in fire anymore. She was the woman who had survived it. She touched the first key. The sound was soft, like a whisper of dawn. Then another note followed and another. The melody rose slowly like the light after a storm. The hall was completely still. No one moved, no one coughed. It was as if the entire audience was holding its breath. Her music told her story without a single word. The pain, the loss, the silence, and then the rise. Her fingers danced over the keys with grace and emotion. Sometimes her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. Every time her heart began to ache, she played through it. As the music swelled, memories flashed before her. The laughter of her parents. The day she won her first piano competition. The flames swallowing the stage, the sound of sirens. She felt everything, yet she kept going. And then something changed. The melody lifted brighter, freer. She wasn't playing about pain anymore. She was playing about strength. About life that continues even after everything has fallen apart. In the audience, people were crying quietly. Some held hands. Some closed their eyes. Even those who didn't know her story could feel it. The struggle, the beauty, the light inside the darkness. By the time she reached the final notes, her fingers were trembling, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She pressed the last key and the sound filled the air like a heartbeat before slowly fading away. Silence. For a few long seconds, no one made a sound. Then the hall erupted into applause. It wasn't just clapping. It was thunder, it was gratitude, it was emotion breaking loose. People stood, cheering, crying, shouting her name. She sat there frozen, her hands resting on the piano. The sound of the crowd washed over her. Tears streamed down her face beneath the mask. She bowed deeply, overwhelmed. When she lifted her head, she saw the audience still standing. She wanted to say something, but her voice trembled. So instead, she placed her hand gently on the piano and whispered softly, "Thank you." After the concert, reporters waited backstage. But she didn't stay for interviews. She quietly thanked the organizers and slipped out through a side door into the cool night air. Outside, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. She walked slowly, her coat wrapped around her, the mask still on. The sounds of applause still echoed in her ears, blending with the hum of distant traffic. Halfway down the street, she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned, she saw the elderly man who had once encouraged her to play at the first gala, the one who had believed in her when she was still afraid to be seen. He smiled warmly, his eyes full of pride. "You did it," he said quietly. She felt her throat tighten. "I played it all the way through," she whispered. He nodded. "And you played it beautifully. The light you lost, you found it again." She smiled behind her mask, the corners of her eyes glistening. "Maybe I never lost it," she said softly. "Maybe it was just waiting for me to be ready." They stood there under a streetlight, the sound of the city moving around them. Yet for that moment, everything felt still. He looked at her and said gently, "You know, it might be time to take that mask off. Not for them, but for yourself." She hesitated. Her hand reached up but stopped halfway. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. He smiled. "You will be, when the music tells you." That night when she returned home, she placed the mask on her piano and stared at it for a long time. It had been with her through her darkest years, through her fear and her healing. It had been both her protection and her prison. She sat at the piano again, this time without the mask. Her face was bare in the quiet of her room. The scars that once made her hide now felt like part of her strength. She touched them gently, no longer with shame but with acceptance. She began to play again softly, without an audience, without cameras, just her and the piano. Two old friends who had been through everything together. The notes filled her apartment, warm and full of peace. She closed her eyes, feeling the sound wrap around her like light. Later, she recorded that private piece on her phone and sent it anonymously to the same radio station that had once shared her interview. She didn't sign her name. She just wrote one sentence in the message. "For everyone learning to face their own scars, keep playing." The radio host received it and played it live on air the next morning. Listeners immediately recognized her style, her heart. The message spread again, not with her face, not with her identity, but with her spirit. Over the next week, she started visiting hospitals and community centers quietly, offering to play for patients, especially children who had gone through burns and injuries like her. She never mentioned who she was. She didn't need to. Her presence and her music were enough. She played for a little girl who had lost part of her hand, showing her how to press the keys with what she still had. The girl laughed when she managed to play a small tune. That laugh made the pianist's eyes fill with tears of joy. In those quiet rooms, away from fame and noise, she found her true purpose. She realized that her music was never meant to make her famous again. It was meant to make others feel whole. Each time she played, she could see how people's faces changed. Some smiled for the first time in months. Some closed their eyes and let go of their pain for a few minutes. And every time she felt her own heart healing a little more. The mask stayed on her piano, no longer something to hide behind, but a reminder of the journey she had walked, from fire to silence, from silence to music, and from music to peace. And though the world still called her the masked pianist, she had finally unmasked herself in the only way that mattered, through her heart. After months of quiet performances and private visits to hospitals and community centers, the masked pianist began to feel a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in years. Music had returned to her life not as a source of fear or loss, but as a source of connection and purpose. Her days were now filled with small, meaningful moments. A smile from a child who had suffered burns, the soft tears of someone hearing hope in her music for the first time, the gentle nod of a nurse who understood exactly what her notes meant. Despite all this, the world outside her quiet routines had not forgotten her. The story of the masked pianist had spread far and wide. Newspapers, television shows, and social media had turned her into a symbol of resilience. But she cared little for fame. She had learned that music was never about recognition. It was about the hearts it touched. One afternoon, as she returned from a hospital visit, she found an envelope waiting at her door. She opened it carefully, and inside was an invitation. It was from an international music festival, an event held in a grand concert hall in a famous city. They had heard her story and requested her presence. They did not ask her to perform for fame or awards. They wanted her to play for people who had faced immense struggles, people who had lost hope, people who were looking for inspiration. She sat down, staring at the invitation, unsure if she was ready. The thought of a larger audience, cameras, and reporters made her heart race. She had never forgotten the pain of public attention after the fire, and fear lingered like a shadow. But then she thought about all the children she had played for, the patients whose lives had been touched, and the countless strangers who had written to tell her how her music had saved them from despair. Finally, she made her decision. She would go not for herself, not for the world, but for everyone who needed to hear her music. Weeks passed as she prepared for the festival. She practiced tirelessly, perfecting every note of her most cherished pieces, including The Light That Stayed. But more importantly, she practiced with intention, pouring every ounce of emotion, every fragment of her journey, into the music. She wanted her performance to be more than sound. She wanted it to be a story of survival, hope, and courage. The day of the festival arrived. The concert hall was immense, with towering ceilings and rows of seats stretching far into the distance. The audience was diverse: survivors of accidents, children with medical conditions, families who had faced unimaginable challenges, and music lovers from all corners of the world. Everyone waited in quiet anticipation, knowing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Backstage, she sat alone for a moment, feeling the familiar tension in her chest. She touched her face, then the mask, and finally set it aside. This time, she would not hide. She would show herself, not to satisfy curiosity, but to embrace her truth. The host approached her gently. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded. "I am," she replied softly. As she walked onto the stage, a hush fell over the audience. The grand piano gleamed under the bright lights. She sat down, letting her fingers hover above the keys for a moment, feeling the weight of the room and the weight of her own journey. She began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate like the whisper of a gentle breeze. But as the melody unfolded, it grew stronger, fuller, and more profound. Her music told the story of her past, the beauty of her childhood, the promise of a life filled with music, the pain of loss, the darkness of the fire, and finally the light she had found again. Every chord resonated through the hall, reaching deep into the hearts of the audience. Some closed their eyes, letting the music carry them to places they had forgotten. Others leaned forward, holding the hands of loved ones, feeling the emotion she had poured into each note. She played with the intensity of someone who had known true loss and had chosen to rise above it. Her fingers moved with a grace that came not from perfection, but from honesty. Every pause, every flourish, every crescendo carried a story of survival. Halfway through her performance, a young girl in the front row began to cry softly. The girl had recently recovered from a serious accident, and her parents had brought her to the festival in the hope of inspiring her. The music seemed to reach directly to her heart, telling her that pain could be transformed into strength. The girl's mother squeezed her hand, whispering words of encouragement, but the girl's eyes remained on the pianist, completely captivated. Across the hall, an elderly man who had lost his hearing in one ear years ago smiled. Even though he could not hear every note, he felt the vibrations, the rhythm, and the emotion. He closed his eyes, letting the music speak for him, and a quiet sense of peace settled over him. As the performance continued, the masked pianist felt herself becoming part of something greater than herself. She was no longer just a woman with a tragic past. She was a vessel for hope, a messenger for anyone who had faced hardship and still dared to dream. Finally, she reached the climax of her piece. The notes soared, bright and powerful, carrying with them the weight of her journey and the promise of light after darkness. The audience sat in awe, completely absorbed in the story her music was telling. The final chord lingered in the air, resonating like a heartbeat, and then slowly faded. For a moment there was silence, a silence so profound that it felt like the entire hall was holding its breath.